It is important that anything in this podcast or any other content we produce is not misconstrued as medical advice. We cannot diagnose, prescribe, treat, or cure any animal. In order to do any of that, a veterinarian must see your pet in person to develop what is called the veterinarian client patient relationship, or VCPR.
Hi, welcome to the Healing Your Pet podcast. I'm Jesse.
And I'm Alex Roberts.
Yep, and so we're episode 3 now, and
making headway.
Yep, one big thing we were talking about, we were planning to talk about was how much food should you actually feed your dog. And I know last few episodes have been, or I guess the last 2 have been a focus on mainly dog, or I guess what was last week was just pet food types, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
This one's dog focused, but we will do a cat version of this at some point. It's
not going to be like really drastic differences, but cats are first of all, cats are definitely not small dogs. They're very different creatures, but in this instance, there are a lot of similarities, and honestly, I think a lot of episodes we'll end up doing, we'll probably be able to say, this essentially you can apply to both dogs and cats, and we'll try and address like small differences. But for this one, I think we should just say this applies to dogs because cats really are just a little bit different, and because numbers are involved, I think it's worth just giving cats a separate episode on this topic.
Exactly. So, years of working in the pet food industry, I can assure you that most people overfeed their dogs, and especially if you base it off of the recommended feeding, charts that come on your dog's food bag.
Yeah, bag, can, box, whatever it is.
So, what's the best way to even figure out how much to feed your dog?
Yeah, so I'll begin with kind of our 2 major categories that we can talk about if we're going to talk about crunching numbers are, 1, if we're talking about what I would consider fresh food, which I would say is either some kind of gently cooked food that still has moisture in it, or a raw food that still has moisture in it, because that water weight makes a huge difference when we're talking about how to take your dog's body weight and then figure out with math, relatively simple math, but using numbers to figure out how much food to feed my dog. So if we're talking about these quote-unquote fresh foods, it's honestly really easy. The numbers are pretty simple. We'll crunch some in a minute. But the other big category is how to figure out, based on the RER, which stands for resting energy requirements, you can calculate the caloric needs of your dog per day, and then you can use that for kibble. It's a slightly more, there's an actual math equation involved. It's not difficult, but no one wants to do math. And to be honest, there are a ton of online calculators and stuff you can use for that, but what we're going to focus on here is not crunching numbers, because like I said, there's online calculators. No one wants to talk about numbers. That's boring. And you don't really need me to tell you that, because, yet again, Google it. But what I want to talk about really is what I think is more helpful is the reality of how to figure out how much to feed your dog, because all the online calculators, and again, those numbers right on the back of the bag, should make it easy for you, but reality, it's just very different from what an online calculator is going to tell you your dog needs, and probably even more different from what that bag or can or whatever of food is going to tell you your dog needs. The overarching theme is most dogs, your average adult pet dog, and I say pet as in like not a working animal whose energy requirements are going to be higher. So your average adult pet dog needs significantly less food then either a calculator is going to tell you, or that chart on the back of your bag of dog food is going to tell you.
Yeah. So I guess when it comes to this like subject too, you want to be sure that you're going to look at the amount that you're going to calculate, and it's probably going to look like not enough food. You know, what most people are used to are these massive portions of food, and I think that's a big thing. People tend to like they can't get it out of their head when they feed their dog these little amounts. It's like, that doesn't look like enough food. But it's like just so important to feed the right amount of food. It's the most detrimental thing to your pet's health if you overfeed them at all, and even overfeeding them just a little bit can, like, we have a cat that if you overfeed him a little tiny bit, he plumps right up, and even that's just for a little while.
And
so
a little tiny bit, we're talking 0.1 ounces of food off from what he should be getting. In a matter of 2-3 weeks, he was noticeably, like, you can look at him, be like, where'd your waist go? So
we break out the scale for every feeding in that thing. We're very careful, and you just have to, like, you don't feel bad that you're looking at this food and you're like, they gotta be hungry, they're not getting much food. Like, they're getting enough food.
It's a tough one, because most dogs, especially, this applies to dogs more than cats, you know, they're very food motivated. They are going to try and convince you 24/7 that they are starving to death. And this is really just a psychology issue, and not being a psychologist, I don't know if I have the best advice for you, but you just have to tell yourself you could dump that entire bag of food in front of your dog and they could hork the entire thing down. They're going to, I can almost promise you they'll vomit it right back up, and you could very likely end up in the emergency hospital with pancreatitis, so don't ever do that. But disclaimer, however, hypothetically, if you were to do that, again, your dog would probably throw it back up. Your dog would then immediately eat it all over again. You wouldn't do that. You know, and that's because you can tell yourself, I don't need this. I am not starving to death right now simply because there's food in front of me. But as soon as you put food in front of them, there's actually lots of chemical reactions happening in their body, lots of biochemistry involved. But their brain, simply by smelling food, let alone seeing it, is being told, oh, I need to eat that, I'm hungry. So that's why your dog, you know, every time you have food out, your dog is begging, and sure, you know, maybe it's kind of a training issue, but it's beyond just a training issue. It's physiology. Your dog can't help it. So maybe that's a helpful one. You know, remember that it's just physiology. Your dog literally can't help but think that it's hungry just because there's food there, and I promise you're not starving your dog to death. It's so important that you keep your dog at a healthy weight. It's the simplest thing you can do to keep your dog healthy and avoid vet bills. And we'll have to do at least an episode, if not multiple episodes, on obesity, but there's our soapbox there, I guess.
So when it comes to this, like, how would you simplify this and break it down for people? Like, how do you tackle this issue of how much to feed?
So big factors that we need to think about there are a lot of factors in the dog itself. Then the food, there are also a lot of factors, but let's focus on the dog itself. Those are probably most important factors. So the age of your dog, the obvious one is puppies need more than adult dogs. And, you know, if you read the back of a bag of food, unless it's like an adult-only food, it'll tell you how much to feed a puppy, and it's going to be a lot more than an adult dog. I will say those are instances where what it tells you to feed a puppy might actually be pretty accurate. A lot of times puppies really do need so much more food that big number on the back of that bag could actually be more realistic for what a puppy may actually need. Again, your average puppy, there are differences here, but something a lot of people don't think about is as your dog ages, somewhat exponential, I would say, and then kind of tapers off with it's a decrease in their caloric needs over time. There are some big jumps in there. So one is, again, very general rule of thumb, but right around a year old, it's kind of this magic number where a lot of animals suddenly require much less food. They kind of magically go from this puppy phase, needing a ton of food, to suddenly an adult and need much less food. And what happens is, of course, most people you don't think about it that way. You don't think, oh, we've hit one magic number, gotta cut back the food, because no one tells you that.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is a lot of dogs hit one, and because no one really tells you that, you're not thinking about it, and suddenly your dog goes from this perfectly in shape puppy body to kind of a chunky adult body, and this will happen within a matter of like a couple months. It's incredibly common. I can't tell you how often I see it. And really that's what it boils down to, is just kind of going from puppy needs to adult needs. There are other factors there as well. I'll get to those in a sec. But then the older your dog gets, they kind of slowly then, over the next few years, start requiring a little less at a time. And then as they get more into their senior years, which of course, varies by breed and generally speaking by size. So this might be 7 years old for really large breeds. But generally I'm thinking more like 10 plus for kind of your average medium-sized healthy dog. They then again require much less food, and there's not a magic number to figure this out. You really do have to look at what has kept them at a healthy weight up until this point, and keep in mind that you've got to watch for subtle signs of weight gain. Alright, so next factor, kind of going back to puppies and differences with that magic 1-year-old number. A big one is spaying and neutering. So this is a massively controversial subject. There's the latest data is pretty interesting on it. Maybe we could do an episode on that too. But in the United States, at least, we're in in America here, it is still very much commonplace to spay and neuter your pet. And when that happens depends on your veterinarian's personal experience and depends on the breed. I would say those are the two biggest factors. Generally, your vet will recommend a little bit older with a larger breed dog, and they could recommend as young as 6 months for like a small breed dog. And again, within that, it really depends on veterinarian's personal experience. But generally between 6 months and a year, and I would say on average closer to 1 year old, is when that happens. So that magic 1 year old number is, partially small to medium breed dogs are considered adults at 1 year old. So they just all on their own naturally require less calories, but it's also generally right after they've been spayed or neutered. So that is a huge factor in that magic 1 year old number, suddenly needing so much less food. And then breed, we kind of touched on that already a bit, but breed, it's a huge factor as well. And no matter what the age, breed is a big factor. So some things to think about. First of all, something I just want to get out of the way is there are a lot of breed-specific diets out there. A lot of
marketing.
Honestly, it's mostly marketing.
Mm-hmm.
It's really mostly marketing to get you to pay for something that you don't need. We'll just put it that way. But when I say breed differences, I'm mostly talking about size, the size of, the breed as an adult, and then the activity level of that breed. So some breeds, whether, if we're talking like a working breed, even if they're just being kept as a pet and they're not getting all that exercise that they're intended for, they still have a higher resting energy requirement. So they have a higher, we'll say they have a higher metabolic rate. That, for most people, that's a nice, simple way to think of it.
Mm-hmm.
So smaller breeds, kind of small to medium breeds, if they're not a working breed or a super high energy, high strung individual, they actually said that backwards. I'm sorry. Smaller or medium breeds who tend to be these higher strung individuals, whether they're working breeds or not, they tend to be these higher strung individuals, tend to have a little bit higher of that resting energy requirement. Whereas older breeds, if they are older breeds, oh boy, larger breeds, if they are not a working breed, and definitely if they're not an animal that actually has a job, they tend to be these more laid back individuals and then tend to have lower resting energy requirements. So this all equates to needs less food. Okay, so working breeds, the poster child of the working breed that has a really high resting energy requirement, even if they're just kept as a pet, is the German short-haired pointer. GSP owners, you know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Your dog eats a lot of food,
yeah.
and it's like no matter how much you feed them, they keep this lovely lean physique, and you can generally see those rib shadows as they're moving, But pros and cons. At least your dog doesn't, become fat if you look at them too hard. But of course the con is it costs more to feed them more.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say those are probably our biggest factors that you have to keep in mind here, to think about how much to feed.
Okay, so just to go over those, it's age, size, breed, activity, and then did you cover this one here? Or are you going to cover this one?
So if you have a pregnant or nursing dog, and honestly, I don't generally cover this because the reality is most people don't have pregnant or nursing dogs. Kind of a niche situation. But if you have a pregnant nursing dog, as well as like a very young puppy, you can fall more into the category of sometimes I actually recommend free feeding those animals. It's like the only situation I'll recommend free feeding an animal. Because they really do just have such high caloric requirements. But yeah, again, kind of its own niche that probably doesn't really apply to anyone or almost anyone listening.
Okay.
Go ahead. What was next?
So you have all these factors involved, right? How do you apply those to actually figuring how much your dog needs to eat, though, right? Because it's like you're supposed to take all these factors into account, but how is that applicable when you're actually trying to find how much to feed?
Yep. Okay, so the first one where I can give you a pretty easy number is if we're talking about, again, back to our fresh food and how that's a little easier to calculate.
Mm-hmm.
So the recommended magic number is about 2 to 3% of your dog's body weight in pounds, which is nice for us Americans, not kilos. So dog's body weight in pounds, you feed approximately 2 to 3% of that in pounds of fresh food. But again, that's with water weight. If you did the same thing with kibble, that would be an absurd amount. It would be even much more than they're going to recommend on a bag. So that's an easy one, but that's the recommendation. So reality, I often recommend starting off, if especially if we're talking about a new dog here, or if we're switching to a new food, we really don't have a good basis for what this dog has done well on in the past. I recommend more like 1.5% of the dog's body weight, or 1.5 to 2%. And again, here's where if you've got that small high energy dog or even a larger working breed dog, okay, you could be more in the 2.5% range,
Okay.
but most individuals don't require 3% of their body weight. You'll see some people will say 2 to 4% of body weight. That 4% is like a pregnant dog, a lactating dog,
Got it.
a brand new puppy. That's no healthy adult
Would eat
average
that much?
dog would eat that much. Yeah, that's more of your.
Do you adjust that percentage over time? So you say you take age into account, and let's say you're feeding at that 1.5%. Does that change over time, or does it stay static?
Yeah, so it can go down even further over time. So if, let's say, a young adult, relatively active, 75, let's say a lab, a young adult lab, everyone's got a retriever, right? It seems like a good one. So,
Yep.
Young adult, they love a couple walks every day. They're maybe walking 2 1-mile walks a day. I'm just thinking like average real life here. Most people in reality aren't able to walk their dogs much more than that when they're keeping them as pets. It's a year or two old, maybe 2-3 years old. They're in that 2-ish% range, and maybe by the time they're like 5 to 7 years old, they could be in like the 1.75% range. We're talking really small increments here as far as moving up and down the scale. And then by the time they're 9, 10 plus years old, they're probably going to be in the 1.5% range or less. And that's where I can't think of any instance I would ever recommend starting off at less than 1.5%, because that is, we're kind of lowballing it. But oftentimes I will recommend starting off low, like in that 1.5%-ish range, and going from there, because I would rather, and this is again this would be a good like obesity talk, but I would rather have you start maybe at a little less than your dog needed and say, ooh, they're just a touch thin, let's up their food a little bit, because that is so much easier to get weight back on a dog than it is to
lose it.
Exactly. If we rounded up with the food and went, ooh, they gained 5 pounds. Man, is it hard to get that weight back off.
Yep.
So that's hopefully a simple way to look at that, is if you're on the fence or you're in between, it doesn't hurt to round down a little bit, and it's just really important to watch your dog's weight.
Yeah, and that what you mean by watching your dog's weight, though, isn't putting them on a scale, right? It's body condition.
Yes.
So you check the ribs, their hip bones, and you should take a topographical photograph of your dog, and that's a good way to keep records. And what are you looking for when it comes to body condition?
Yeah. So first of all, for body condition score, you can Google it for a chart on a scale of 1 to 9. There are ones that go from 1 to 5. I don't like those as much. It's just not as precise. So 1 to 9. Most breeds, a 4 is perfect, not a 5. So between a 4 and a 5 is considered ideal. But keep in mind, most breeds, a 4 is what we're looking for, not a 5. So, just like Jesse said, what we're looking for is you should be able to run your fingers down their ribs and be able to feel their ribs easily. You should not have to poke to feel ribs. And as this is a little specific per breed, but generally speaking, when the dog moves, I want to be able to see a shadow of especially their last few ribs as they're moving. Now, if your dog is standing still and you can see half of their ribs relatively easily,
Too thin?
They're underweight. Yeah,
Yep.
That's underweight. And then the other thing that you can touch, and of course there are a million other things, but these are just the easiest ones, and they're very telling. They're really helpful. Oh, we have a visitor, ginger cat visitor. So the points of the hips should feel, again, easily palpable. You should be able to feel them. You should not have to poke through fat to feel them, but they shouldn't be obvious if the dog, especially if the dog is standing still. You shouldn't be able to visibly see big points sticking out, and when you touch them, they should feel a bit rounded. So you should be able to feel that bone easily, but it shouldn't feel like sharp and pointy. And then pictures. I recommend take one picture standing straight above your dog so you can see their waist, right? They should have an hourglass waist. Any breed, I mean, even when we're talking Mastiffs, should have a waist. They're not going to have much of one, but you should see a difference between their rib cage to their waist and then back out to their hips. And then the other one is side profile picture, so you can kind of see a tummy tuck.
Mm-hmm.
Yet again, even your Mastiff breeds should have a little bit of a tummy tuck. They should not just have this flat line across their belly.
Yeah, it's a good way to keep the pictures. Is a great way to monitor too,
It's
right?
the best way.
So it's
yeah.
like you can
So,
actually see progress.
Exactly. Those are the best ways to monitor. And what I recommend in a perfect world is once a week, you take those pictures. You take one from the top, one from the side, and you have a little journal, and you write one sentence for ribs felt like this, hips felt like this.
Mm-hmm.
That is my go-to recommendation. It's really is doable. You know, it takes you less than 5 minutes once a week, and just make that part of your routine. Set a reminder for Sunday evening or Saturday morning, whatever it is.
Right.
Just try and make it happen, and then it's easy.
Right. Okay. So before we wrap this up here, I guess most people feed kibble to their dogs, and obviously the 2 to 3% body weight rule doesn't apply to kibble. All kibbles are different, but the kibble manufacturers are going to recommend you feed way too much food for your dog because it's good marketing. It's good for business.
It's how they
Return
make
customers. They gotta feed a lot of the food, and unfortunately, like we said earlier, years of working in the industry, I know most dogs I ever see are overweight, and it's most people feed kibble, which is highly processed. So I know there's not a magic formula for calculating kibble, but what would you recommend?
Yep. So, first of all, super, super important to use a standard measuring cup for actually any type of food, kibble, canned food, raw food, I don't care what it is. Use a measuring cup. So for kibble, definitely go measuring cup. If, just real briefly, touching back on fresh food, weighing it or using a measuring cup. Pick one, stick with it, doesn't matter, whatever you find easier.
Mm-hmm.
But with kibble, measuring cup, weighing kibble that's just more work. So, standard 8-ounce measuring cup. Pick a measuring cup, make that your designated dog food cup, because unfortunately, different measuring cups, one that says 8 ounces and another one that says 8 ounces can be surprisingly variable, much more so than you'd like it to be. So just pick one and stick with it. That's super important. My general rule of thumb tip that I'm going to give you for how to, here's how much my dog weighs, here's how much it says to feed on the back of this bag, now what? Go with 75% of what it says to feed. So, super important to factor in everything we talked about, the age, the breed, the activity level of your dog, whether they're spayed or neutered or not. And certainly if it gives a range for what to feed, some companies give a range, some companies just give a set number. So if they just give a set number, I would definitely go for that, go for 75% of what it says to feed. If it gives a range, maybe start off with the lowest end of that range. That can be a reasonable way to go to, but basically just everything is round down.
That's just same thing. Monitor body condition.
Yep.
And then you can try to bump it up a teeny bit more if they're underweight. If they're not losing weight or they're not at a good condition, drop it down, right?
Yep. And we'll talk about how to safely lose weight.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll do an obesity episode because that's more numbers. So
Right.
I don't think we need to add any more numbers
Yeah.
here.
All right. Well, anything else you need to add before we close this out?
I don't think so.
Okay.
So
Cool. Well, yeah, I guess we'll be back with more tips, etc. Substack is a good way to keep up with the constant updates before the website comes out. We're just it's Healing Bay Pet is the Healing Bay, like BAY, is a good way to reach it. I'll put the link with the video, and then and Facebook is another one, same thing, Healing Bay Pet Nutrition, and then you could follow up there until the website's active, and there's lots of tips. I'm putting all this information is out there, and there'll be more to come. So don't feel too overwhelmed. But this is just a good step to the biggest step towards having a healthy dog is just feed it the right food and the right amount.
Yep, it really is. Can save you a ton of vet bills. Just those two things.
Yep. All right. Well, see you next time.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. We'd love your feedback on what you think of the podcast, even the formatting of it. For example, if you prefer a longer or a shorter podcast, let us know. We genuinely want to be as helpful as possible for our listeners. And of course, share this with your friends and family so that we can help their pets live their healthiest lives possible. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and we post a video version on the major video streaming platforms. Wishing you and your furry family members good health. Bye for now.